taught at the University of Texas at Austin, at Howard University, and at the University of Houston. He received his bachelor's degree and his master's in philosophy at the University of Houston, and got his PhD in philosophy at Harvard. Professor Cormier's research focuses mainly on pragmatism. This is his book that he published a few years back, The Truth is What Works, available on Amazon. And published by Roman and Littlefield. He also has expertise in aesthetics and in ethics, and the connection then with ethics and race theory. Today, the paper that he's going to be, or the presentation he's going to be giving us is entitled, Is There a Black Race in Reality? So, I'd like to then bring Professor Cormier.
Thank you all for coming today. Thanks, Mark, David, for having me. This thing on the computer here that I didn't print it out mainly because I don't really want to stick to, I have this paper here, I could read it, but there's nothing more boring than sitting listening to a paper. So I thought I'd sort of start by throwing some ideas out, and I was wondering if maybe we could conduct this as a kind of a discussion on the topic of whether there's a black race in reality, whether there are really any black people. I mean, that question seems a little silly, right? I mean, it's obvious there's several black people in the room, right? So, okay, case closed, you know, I'll go home. Well, no, not quite. Because, as you will probably all have heard, some scientists say that there just is no such thing as race. There is no such a thing as race. You know, you can't divide some people into white people and some people into the black people. Different people deploy the numbers differently. According to one nice succinct formulation, these nice succinct formulations often turn out to be much less helpful than they seem at first glance. But anyway, according to one formulation, there's about a 15% genetic variation between any two human individuals. Looking at different sites on the genome, right, we'll find 15% different things between any two human individuals. And apparently less than half of that, about 6%, is accounted for by the typical racial group. So a randomly selected white person can easily be genetically more similar to an African than to another white person. Now, I'll throw it out to you to start. Right? How many people are very impressed by that as a proof that there are no races? There's only a small amount of genetic difference that's attributable to race. Are we all impressed by that? Is that proven? Anybody not impressed by that? Just the beginning, okay? You're not necessarily impressed. Anybody not impressed on biological grounds? Because I'm sort of not impressed by that on biological grounds. Because you can sort of abstract from those individual differences and consider human beings and chimpanzees. Right? Human beings and chimpanzees have about 98.5% identical DNA. So there's a very little difference. Some people think that chimpanzees ought to be classed in the genus human, along chimpanzees and us and moths obviously results developmentally in very great differences, right? Numbers of legs, wings, and the powerful working forward that distinguishes us from the chimpanzee. No such significant differences are produced by the small amount of genetic difference between or among the races. There's nothing comparable to a difference in, some people do think that there's like a difference in brain size between blacks and whites, but brain size per se doesn't necessarily make all that much difference. There seems to be a difference in brain size between men and women. That doesn't mean that men are smarter than women. And so maybe these small differences exist, but they don't seem to mark out anything important. The differences among the races are skin deep. And frankly, they're not even skin deep. I mean, why does anybody know why it is that people get darker in hot climates with lots of sun? I mean, you might think it would be the other way around, right? I mean, if it's a hot, sunny day, what clothes do you put on? You want light-colored clothes on to reflect the sun's energy. And if it's a cold day, you want dark-colored clothes on to absorb as much of the heat as you can. Why doesn't nature do that for us? Why does nature make us darker in the hot climates, in the hot, sunny climates, and lighter in the cool climates? Melanin, yeah. That's how it works. Why does the melanin make us darker?
Basically, the amount of UV that's coming through causes problems in the body. So the more UV, the more pigment you want to block out.
Well, okay, how does pigment block out UV, right? Doesn't pigment absorb UV? So wouldn't you think that the less melanin, the more reflective UV, and you'd be nice and cool and be saving yourself from all that UV radiation? Why doesn't it work like that? That's the thing. Okay.
Nah, you can't, even if a white person in Africa for 1,000 years, I think will become white.
That's true, although when white people are outside, they do get darker, right? They do get tans. Melanin works.
That's not no genetic, that ain't gonna sound right.
It's genetic in a sense, right? It's genetic in a sense, though, right? I mean, genes produce the same melanin cells,
But
right?
I just said they had the same genes as the original. The same.
Let's grant that we took David there and took Professor Hill to Grant and took him to Africa. He's not going to turn black. He's going to get darker. He's not going to turn black. My point is, he is going to get darker, and the issue is, why in the world would he get darker? How does getting darker help anything? Right? And genetics has made the people who are native to that area darker. How is it helping them to be darker rather than lighter? You understand the question? It's kind of a puzzle, isn't it? I've always wondered about this ever since I was a little kid. I was like, well, why in Africa don't they turn silver? Right? That would be even better, right? Just reflect as much of that energy as possible.
Because of the darker skin, then prevents you from burning and being harmed by the
Yeah,
sun.
how? That's the question.
How?
Yeah, how does it work? Here's the answer. The darker skin is right on the surface. Right? Melanin-containing cells, the pigment-containing cells, are right on the surface, and therefore they absorb the sun's UV energy right at the surface. And you can't penetrate to the deeper layers of skin. That's where it causes trouble, right? The UV rays get into the deep. A deep sunburn is the worst kind of sunburn you can have. A very superficial sunburn, well, I mean, most of this skin at the surface is like dead ink, so it doesn't really make any difference. Right? So you want to be dark right on top. And like if you were to cut a black person open, please don't get any ideas, but if you were to cut a black person open, right, you notice that the dark stuff is right on the surface, and it's pink right underneath. Right? It's the same color as the white person's, right underneath the surface. So, race, you might say, isn't even skin deep. Right? It's right there on the surface. It's just a question of keeping the sun's rays from getting inside, from going to the sun. All right. So, no biologically significant categories are marked when we talk about race. When we identify people as black or white or brown or yellow or red, or, when we identify people by the that's what some scientists say. Some scientists don't agree, though, interestingly enough. Some scientists do believe in race, and some people put science aside altogether as the deciding factor. I'm sure some of you have heard the idea of strategic essentialism, or treating race as a social or socio-historical category. You don't look to science to, science is the voice of God, we have to say. Why do I care what the scientists, pronounces about whether there are races? Look at social issues, look at social history, and there you can see that there's absolutely no trouble marking out the black people from the white people. It's very easy to, and it's very easy to see that those categories have made a lot of historical difference. But part of the problem is that, well, how many races are there? Right? We start talking about the standard terminologies or the standard way of dividing people up into races. We quickly realize there isn't really a standard way of doing it. There are lots of different ways of doing it. I mean, how many races are there? 3 races? Are there 5 races? Some people would mark out 17 different races. Let me read a little passage to you from W.E. Du Bois. This is from his little text called The Conservation of Races. He says, does everybody know who W.E. Du Bois was? He says, we find upon the world stage today 8 distinctly differentiated races in the sense in which history tells us the word must be used. They are the Slavs of Eastern Europe, the Teutons of Middle Europe, the English of Great Britain and America, the Romance nations of Southern and Western Europe, the Negroes of Africa and America, the Semitic people of Western Asia and Northern Africa, the Hindus of Central Asia, and the Mongolians of Eastern Asia. There are, of course, other minor race groups such as the American Indians, the Eskimo, and the South Sea Islanders, whose larger races too are far from homogeneous. The Slav includes the Czech, the Magyar, the Pole, and the Russian. The German includes the German, the Scandinavian, and the Dutch. The English include the Scotch, the Irish, and the conglomerate American. So notice how many different races. And ordinarily today you wouldn't think of the Slavs as characterizing their own racial group, right? They're just part of the white people. So and if you look back through the history of people talking about race, you find all different kinds of racial categorizations. People keep carving up the human pie in all kinds of different ways, and there's no particular reason to believe that any one of them sort of matches up with nature's way of dividing up the human pie. I mean, it's not even clear that nature has a way of dividing up the human pie. What do you think about that as an argument against the existence of black people, right? People we typically mark out as black. The argument is that you could divide black people up into smaller groups. You could put more people in with black people. There's simply no answer in nature to the question of who the black people are. What do you think about that? Does anybody know Du Bois' answer, by the way? What do you thought about it? Du Bois thought that these different groups, that it was better to think in terms of these different groups. It was better to mark off, the Africans and their descendants in America as one racial group, because he thought all of these groups had something to contribute. He thought that the black race and the black people had a message to send to the world. You probably guessed what that message was. What do you think that message is? Anybody got a clue? Okay. Do you think that there's anything as a black person you have in your experience that you could tell people about? Oppression, right? The history of black oppression and the history of contempt, right? Being treated with contempt. The history of being treated not as an equal. The history of not being free, right? We presumably, as black people, have learned something about that, and we can bring that message to the rest of the world. Right? And it's because of our ability to do that that it's good that black people think of themselves as a separate group, maybe hold themselves somewhat apart from the rest of humanity, and say we are a group with this message. The rest of the peoples of humanity have all done their job. They've all contributed their message. Now we have ours to contribute, and it's important for that reason that we think of ourselves as black people, that we think of ourselves as a group. Any thoughts about that? Can anybody think of any drawbacks associated with that idea? Any problems?
One question I hear that we alluded to earlier, there are so many ways you can slice the pie. You tend to the characteristics you're looking at.
genes.
Right. And so if you look at the people of Africa, you'll find 7-foot tall people, you'll find, 3-foot tall people, you'll find people, people who are hard to distinguish from their Arab neighbors, people who, I had a student from Equatorial Africa, a place in Ghana. She's very proud. She used to tell me, Mr. Cormier, in Ghana we're the blackest people in the world. Very proud of me, very proud. There are some black people who are so black they're almost blue, and again, contrast those with the reddish black people, all different brownish black people, so all different shades are found in Africa. Not to mention here in America, right, where there's been all sorts of admixtures in with the African stock, I'd say. So, what could you use to distinguish black people? I mentioned a second ago that Du Bois offered a socio-historical criteria. As you said a second ago, what we black people have in common is this history of oppression, this history of contempt, this status as being the people who, when they walk into a room, everybody goes, oh, one of them, right? That's how you mark the black people out. You mark out by a socio-historical criteria, not by some genetic or,
And how far back does that history go of being identified as an oppressed people? And if that's the case, then not all people from Africa necessarily would experience the same kind of oppression. So you might be excluding some people from that definition because they never had experienced historically kind of oppression.
That's a good point. And he puts it in terms of a badge of insult. I think that's his terminology, a badge of insult. It's something, again, nobody has any trouble identifying the black people in this room. That's not to say that that's because we black people in this room all have some specific, identifiable, large, significant genetic inheritance in common. What we have in common is a socio-historical, whatever, like, we have a history of, and then, yeah, that history doesn't go back to the beginning of when there were black people. Presumably there were black people. They would count as members of this race that Du Bois has described. But if you go back historically, there'll have to be a historical cutoff point, presumably. And who knows, maybe someday when the socio-historical problems are solved, the black race will not exist anymore. But right now it does exist as this group that's oppressed. What do you think of that? Would that satisfy you? You're shaking your head. You don't like that. Okay, why not? What's wrong?
Well, see, you classifying black people to Africa and America, but there's a whole diaspora of black people. You got Aborigine blacks, you got the blacks up under in India. Which blacks you talking about?
You got blacks in India. We certainly do have very dark-skinned people in India who are discriminated against because of their dark skin, at least in part. Certainly, right. And Australia.
Black, they got black Filipino, not there brought by slavery. So again,
Yes.
diaspora level, or you know what I'm saying? This seems like you equate it to Negro. There's a difference.
Yeah, keep in mind, it's not me doing this, but I'm explaining what Du Bois thought. And
So
yeah, I
far,
think
putting the genes together, now, okay, the monkey, man, had the same basic genes. That's all that's really telling me is all elements come from one. You know what I'm saying? You gotta take the flesh back to the earth back to the sun. You know what I'm saying? Simple.
yeah, well, I mean, yeah, we're close to the chimpanzees, we're close to the moths. I was trying frantically before I came over here to figure out, I was looking on the internet trying to find out if I could figure out the percentage that we share with bananas. As somebody pointed out, the percentage we share with bananas is substantial, right? Yeah, okay, we're all animals and we're all creatures on the earth.
So all your physical makeup comes from, everything comes from one, basically. The purest you can get is vibration.
Okay, all right, so what makes, suppose I don't talk in terms of Negroes.
What I'm
right?
saying
Negroes.
is, what you're linking is so far as linking some similarities genetically of things and living things like bananas, you're just linking. That has nothing to do with the no existence of the black race. You know what I'm saying? That just tells you that everything from the universe, all of the universal makeup comes from one essence.
What does distinguish the black race?
Huh?
Can you tell me anything in a short sentence or two? What does
What are
distinguish
you
the black
talking
race?
about? You talking about a race or discrimination. So like, okay, the race, like, oh, we wanna go first, or you talking about like the different, what do you call it, the different, cause like, even within the culture, there's so many different, it's, what's that word? There's different variations of one. So you can't even, if you look at it on that perspective, you want to get the whole of the whole. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, okay, you're talking about the black people who travel out of Africa, the small diminutive people who still are spread across the world to today, the patches, or you're talking about the Australian types. You know what I'm saying? It came later. Or,
Keep in mind, I'm not trying to talk about any group. I'm just trying to figure out. Right now, I'm throwing out some suggestions from W. Du Bois and so forth. I haven't made up my mind at all about these issues. I'm trying to figure it out. So help me out here.
no, it's wrong.
Yeah. Okay. I have an open mind.
Well, I see the genetic thing you was talking about had nothing to do with whether there's a black race or not. All I see that is equating to is everything in the universe was one. You know what I'm saying?
I like the idea of the shared experiences, whatever those might be. But you have to combine the shared experiences with some shared physical characteristics. I think when you put those two together, then you can come up with the black race or the Asian race or whatever you want to come up with. Because people are all shades of colors. And so just a shade of color is not enough. But if you put up enough shared similar physical characteristics with the shared similar experience or cultural background, I think experience is more to the point. Then I think you can
Okay.
But I'm just getting a little confused, because even when you come up the Aborigines and the people that are in India, they're a dark race, and they're all broad dimensions people, but they also have oppression too, the Aborigines. So, I mean, it would seem to me that they're still, even if they're not classified as Negroes, I don't think that's what you were doing. You were just, it sounded like you were saying that Du Bois was talking about groups of people, a certain type of people that seem to be oppressed all the time. And when you do put it on another continent, it's still those same types of people. It's still the same types. I guess India, way back in the day, maybe before I was around, I understand they had a Black Panther type party thing going over there too because of the oppression. I don't know the terms.
They still do have oppression, and there's still people fighting the so-called untouchables.
That's
Or the Dutchies, I think, for sure. They're oppressed within the society. It has to do with dark skin. It has to do with the fact that the ruling people in India have a European ancestry, in fact, and lighter skin. They don't put it in terms of skin color, but that figures prominently in the problem. So if we adopt Du Bois's criterion for black people, this history of oppression, we're going to get some surprising results. We're going to find some people in India who get to be part of the black race. The Aborigines in Australia, they were certainly oppressed very violently by the Europeans who came there. Maybe they get brought into the black race. And these physical characteristics, they begin to become a little shaky. Yeah,
That would be my point. You can tell the difference between someone from Australia, someone from Africa, someone from
yeah. I mean, you can tell the difference, but there is one physical thing that they have in common. They have this badge of insult. They are darker. Maybe that's a way of looking at it.
Could you also say that maybe what makes Du Bois, what motivates him to create this distinction is that skin color is used as a signifier. It becomes a sign for a certain group of people in America, maybe in the West. And so it's not just the skin color, it's skin color used as a signifier for something else, some lower status, lower ability.
Right. So, I think that's the idea of a badge, right? The badge isn't just a physical thing. A badge is a physical symbol. It's
Talking about there's physical differences between Aborigines and Indians. Well, people in Africa, there's physical differences. The Europeans are different from the South Africa.
and even here in America, right, among the different blacks, right? I mean, we don't all look alike by any stretch of the imagination. Right? We all look very different. physical markers. Some people have criticized Du Bois as not having offered something that hangs together and makes sense. They want to say, and they want to go back and say, look, if you can't use some kinds of physical thing by itself to mark off the black people, you're better off just forgetting the characterization altogether. Kwame Anthony Appiah, an Afro-British philosopher, maybe he's now Afro-British American because he was teaching at Princeton, has been living in America for a while. Lives in New York City. He argues that the term black is a lot like the term witch. Now, you can look back through history and find that there's a group of people who have been identified as witches. And it's been very significant in their lives that they've been identified as witches, right? I mean, they've been burned at the stake and all kinds of other things bad to them because they were witches. But of course, there really aren't any witches. And you can tell if you look closely enough at the scientific facts. There are no women who sleep with the devil and gain power because of that. Right? The science suggests that's the case. And you look back at the facts of how these women got accused of being witches, who were the people who were usually being picked out as witches? Well, people like midwives, right? And these were people who were closer to the mystery of life, and it seemed to give them a kind of power. And because of that, they were picked out and picked on by the males of the time, right? They seemed to threaten the power of the males, so for that reason they were put down. What should you do with this concept of witch that really does pick out people who have significant consequences of oppression in their lives? Well, you should throw it out, right? You should look at the scientific evidence that there really aren't any witches. And you should say, well, that's just a bad, it's a word that survives, but it really doesn't have any use. It really doesn't pick out any people, really. And maybe you should do the same with black. Just if you're less likely to, start rounding people up and burning them at the stake again, if you just get rid of the concept of witch, maybe you're less likely to start, discriminating against people in appropriate ways if you get rid of the concept of black altogether, since it depends on this spurious, specious, doubtful, physical notion, whether you think of it as a socio-cultural phenomenon or not. How about that?
It sounds good in theory.
All right. Well, what are the practical problems, or can you name a practical problem?
Everything don't have.
Well, I think-
Everybody's, go ahead. I don't reach out.
I think that, all of the mileage and money that's been made out based upon this designation by those in power. I mean, you're cutting up the game. The economy going on for 500 years, and now you come back and saying, change the economy. There's too much money involved.
Well, how about witch?
There wasn't that much in the game. I mean, they was out this Halloween talking about they got a bad rap. Okay, but it was like, okay, it's 30 minutes, you got 30 minutes of fame, it's cool. But I'm saying, if you're talking about changing the con from saying, here are these folk that we've been oppressing all this time, and all of a sudden now they don't exist, then how are we going to oppress them anymore? How are we going to deal with it in the school system? How are we going to deal with socialization? How are we going to deal in terms of money?
Yeah.
How are we going to do the experiments on folks if, we ain't got this, how about the labor pool? We got this labor pool of folks that can't do nothing, and, you telling me that basically we're going to change up and, do all that? Insurance companies would kill you.
Well, there are, again, you can think of things like insurance companies, right? People do note that black people have shorter lifespans. Some controversy about somebody who was running in the last election that said, of course, the campaign that genetically black people had shorter lifespans, and that's wrong. I think it is true epidemiologically that black people have shorter lifespans, but that doesn't have anything necessarily at all to do with genetics. It could have more to do with poverty and depression. That's what there was a what do you call it? There was a ballot measure out in California. Ward Connerly, this guy who is one of the regents, I think, of University of California, was in favor of eliminating all talk of race from all state documents. Right? There's not going to be any reference to race in any state document because his idea is, look, this is a biologically, scientifically
continue seeing the disparity between various groups. I mean, it would be nice to buy into that concept if it was authentic, but it came into existence because of real world situations. And so between a witch and African Americans or another group of color, the difference is one is a faith-based belief in the creation of this particular individual or entity or group, and another one's a physical, societal.
Well, but think about it, right? I mean, as we've been bringing up in the discussion here, figuring out what the physical thing is that all black people have in common is pretty hard. Science says you're wrong if you think it's anything significant, right? Skin color, well, I mean, there are people just as dark in Australia as there are in Africa and in parts of America, right? They aren't necessarily part
Well,
of the
in
same
America,
racial
it
group.
don't matter. If you have a decent enough pigmentation in your skin, somebody with color, you might be a black, you might be an African black, you might be a South American black, but you're still black, you're non-white, essentially.
Okay, so that's the thing. That'll work well enough as the physical criteria that all black people have in common. I mean, essentially, you're already ruling out those light-skinned black people who could pass, right? They don't really count for your criteria.
It's the perception.
The world works on physical appearance no matter what. It's just not gonna happen. For example, if you put, okay, I'll just break it down. If you put an Asian woman, a white woman, an African American woman, have us all standing backwards like this, okay? You're gonna see the Asian woman's dark hair, you'll see maybe a Caucasian woman, blonde, red, or red hair. But when you go to the black woman, when you get to the black woman, you're gonna know who's black from the back. Even if she has braids, I don't really do. But then if she has her hands down, it's like this, you're gonna see that physical characteristic. It's the color, it's the physical thing. That's what the world, unfortunately, that's what the world
Are you sure about that?
Yeah, when you walk in the door, when someone walks in the door, you see them, yeah, you can tell if they're cute or ugly. But that's probably not the first thing you
Two
look
words,
at.
2 words. Lynette McKee. You know who Lynette McKee is? The actress Lynette McKee.
Very fair skin.
Very fair skin, very light colored hair, right? If you saw her from the back, I think you might have some difficulty.
Well, yeah, with Mariah Carey, the same thing. But when you're actually a black woman, I'm talking about the skin color. When you are black and you walk up, somebody's gonna notice it. But if you have the other ethnicities, they can't pass. We can't, person my color can't pass.
Yeah, well, that's true enough. Okay, yeah.
It sounds like what Aki was addressing though too is that there's something really seemingly irrational to me about hinging your entire identity on pigmentation. Because we're much more multifaceted than that as individuals. There's much more difference between individuals and
I mean, the whole
so
motivation.
they're not black because they're black.
The motivation here,
for that.
the motivation here is that, I started out by talking about Du Bois here. What he wants to do is he wants to mark out black people as a cultural group and a social and historical group. Right? And again, blackness, the thing that you see when you walk into the room, it's a badge. But a badge is not just a physical thing, it's a physical thing that operates as a symbol. And he wants to specifically dwell on that symbolic level. That's the important thing here. It's not the color itself, right? Surely it's not the color itself. And this is good because it captures the fact that there are certain people who can pass, right? There are certain people who don't look black, who are black. And there are certain people who look black in certain ways, but whom we wouldn't want to characterize as black in our traditional way of thinking, black people, Negro, or whatever, right? There are people with dark skin in South America, who have nothing to do with Africa.
But they do be black, but they just don't want to admit it. You know how black they go down.
Well, I mean, you can't generalize. I mean, I think there are a lot of light-skinned blacks.
First of all, those people who were in South America, actually, even before Columbus, they was mixing with Asian and black. So the black history goes far beyond slavery. You know what I'm saying? Even before that, they say, the Asian scientists say that yellow people themselves are actually offspring of black people and white people mixed in the cold fire.
Well, that's at least debate, though, right? And what about the Australians? It's not clear that they had anything to do with it. It's not clear they had anything to do with Africa.
One reason they might got straight here, but they definitely got African sort of features, you know, big lips, they're black, there ain't nothing else to it.
Okay, no more debating that. Okay. Yeah, okay.
Edifying.
Okay, all right. Dave.
Just a quick question, maybe think about is, you were talking about some broad pigmentation as being the easily identifiable characteristic that makes obviously someone black. If everyone who was not currently considered black disappeared from America right now, just plucked out, would there be a fight of the remaining people? Would there be a fight over who's really black, or would the word black go the way of the word rich?
So if there were only the black people who could pass for white left, let's say, right? Using our current terminology, I mean, there would be a dispute about what we could do.
Would there be a dispute, or would the word go away? And what would people, would people want to argue for it? Because all of the, if it's a badge, the badge is linked to the oppressor. If the oppressor is gone, how does the word continue to survive in a positive sense for the people who are left? Is it now, oh, you have to prove that you're African descent? Would that become a mode of argument?
I mean, it
Or
certainly
just
does.
become unimportant?
Were you going to deal with that question?
Yeah, I don't, in my way of thinking, I don't link black to the oppressor. I don't really see that as a necessary link. I think it's relevant in terms of the historical connotation and the current social environment in which we live. But if there were no white people in the world, I would still call myself black.
Okay, so I guess then the question that as I would put it then to you is, if this happened, if all of the people who were not currently considered black were gone, would you still admit the very dark-skinned person, Aborigine from Australia? Would everyone in society be black, or would there be the Aboriginal black, the African black, the South American black? Would new terms come about in order to distinguish, or would you say, let's forget about this distinction?
It would go back to what you see, in my opinion, and what you see in the majority of homogeneous societies. And people identify with either their tribe, or their neighborhood, or whatever it may be, their village, their whatever it is. The same way if we go to Asia and we're in one of their countries, well, I'm Hmong, and so you would still figure out a way to cluster, and when we don't do that, we rely on family lineage.
And when you figured out the way to cluster, the word black would be way too clumsy, and it would disappear, right?
Why would it be too clumsy?
Because you'd have Aborigines, you'd have the people who would say, I've been called black for many years, but now that all of the non-blacks are gone, I really would prefer to call myself Aboriginal. And someone else might say, I prefer to call myself of African descent. And those, you would want to be, the more you cluster, the more you want to be precise about what cluster you come from. And the word black is often clumsy when there are no non-blacks in the society.
Well, I think a lot of folks like it because it eliminates the distinction between North America, South America, the continent of Africa. Because if you view it as a collective, then we're black.
Yeah, and there's a possibility of kind of solidarity there. Is that what you're thinking about? Right. Yeah.
So that's what you say, it would go away, the term black would not go away.
It would be American.
In my opinion.
It would be American.
See, I don't think the problem is with the black, having a black race or even the idea of black. It's the attitude towards black. I mean, you asked the question, if we got rid of using the term black, or got rid of using the races, would we be okay? The answer is no. And it's not the fact that there's a black race or there isn't a black race, it's the fact that the attitude towards what people perceive to be a black race. You're never going to change attitudes just by changing the word. We tried that in this country already. We've tried all kinds of stuff to get rid of racism. Racism is not logical. Racism is illogical. And so it's not going to follow a logic pattern. You get rid of race terminology, you're going to get rid of racism. That's not true. I look across this room and what I see is a room full of beautiful people. And some of them have to be a little darker shade than others, but it's all beautiful people. But other people look in this room, they see black, and they see white, and they see Mexican.
Can I just stop you right there, right?
I'll
I mean,
stop
it
right
sounded
there.
to me like the better way of looking at things was your original way, right? The better way of looking at things is to walk into the room and see beautiful people.
Right.
Not to think, okay, there are the blacks, there's a person who might be Indian, might be American Indian, might be Hispanic, might be Asian Indian. I can't really tell. There's a certain brownness of the skin there and darkness of the hair, right? I'm just going to categorize people by their group, you know, according to the way I see them. I mean, that doesn't seem like the best way to do things. It seems like it might be hard to get to your beautiful people way of looking at things, but that might be the better one, right?
Yeah, but, and the other thing is, but they are black, and they are white, and they are brown, and that's what's good. See, it's all about the attitude. If black is dirty, and brown is lazy, and white is corrupt, and yellow is sneaky, well then, none of it's gonna work. But if black is beautiful, and brown is beautiful, and white is, then it all will work.
Somebody like, it isn't just, somebody like Cormier doesn't just, I hate that word just, I hate that word in philosophy. He doesn't just want to get rid of the word. He wants to get rid of the word in favor of thinking scientifically about these things, right? I mean, he wants, at least in this particular article I'm reciting here, the uncompleted argument it's called, he wants to say, let's look scientifically at the facts, and once we begin to look scientifically at the facts, these prejudices that are the source of so much oppression will begin to go away.
But if you're looking at the world through some type of, like, if you want to use a subjective model, how does that address in any way, shape, or form your actual real-life experience?
Well, I mean, what I was trying to get you to do is not be subjective at all. He wants you to be objective, right? What's the most objective
That's
way
just
of
saying that you
looking?
can be objective.
You certainly can be objective, can't you, about science? Can't you be objective about the
Things
genetic
that are shifting all the
differences?
time, though, even within science. And then if you go out, I mean, to get rid of, like, scientifically, race does not get rid of racialization as I experience it in my everyday lived experience, walking around in my community.
Well, certainly scientists do disagree with one another about the topic of race, and that's something worth bringing up. There's a division among biological anthropologists. I'm not really exactly sure what counts as a biological anthropologist, but among such people, I understand there's a big debate about whether races are real. Apparently, the people who study bones, right, the people who study the human skeleton, look at things like the thickness of the femur and certain mid-facial characteristics, and they say that you definitely can. You know, you combine, you look at a skeleton in a certain way, you combine 3 or 4 characteristics, and you'll be pretty darn sure you're looking at a black person or a white person or whatever, right? You can get over 80% accuracy in your division of things. Apparently, one way to tell you got a black person's skull is that the opening for the nose looks like an upside-down heart, right? That kind of thing. You look at, match those things up, and you can be pretty darn sure you've got a black person's skeleton or a white person's skeleton. People who study blood, though, they notice that blood is things. There are differences, like there's an IB blood group that's like non-existent among American Indians, but found very plentifully among Asians or something like that. But there's few sharp breaks in blood among the different kinds of people. The differences in blood tend to be what they call clinal differences. They're great gradual gradations among people, not the kinds of sharp breaks you find among bones, like in the bone. Yeah.
What I'm getting from Du Bois is that when you're talking about, color, he's saying that it's not just the color, it's not just the race. I mean, it's not just the culture, but it's the origins of the race, the color in which things like culture sperm. So my question is, do you think that when you talk about color specific, do you think that all the different variations of color, they all derive from a primary or original or sovereign, if you will, phenotype? Because again, I'm getting that Du Bois saying that, hey, we have to look into the origins of race and of color.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think he means the biological origins, right? I mean, he definitely does not want to look back for the ultimate phenotype, and trace the black race from there. He traces the black race from social and historical phenomena that began in particular with racism and slavery and oppression, people being kidnapped out of Africa and brought here before slavery. There weren't any people properly called Negroes, to use the term he would have used in his time. There weren't any such people before that, right? Black people came into existence because of certain sociocultural phenomena. It's true that even those sociocultural phenomena had to do with the physical appearance of these people. It's because they went down to Africa and saw these dark-skinned people in this different kind of society, ready to be plucked off the continent and taken away from servitude. Because they looked different, that had something to do with why they got singled out for oppression. But it's the oppression itself, together with that difference in physical appearance, that creates the black race.
But, I mean, but biology still has to be taken into account. I mean, we were talking about Lonnie McKee.
Yes.
Granted, she's very fair-skinned, but she hasn't said that she's white. She doesn't even look white. She looks like a light-skinned black.
Yes.
I believe she's biracial.
Is that
So, I mean, biology has to be taken into account. I mean, we just can't talk about the aftermaths of race. I mean, I'm almost getting the impression that, you know, black or the race being black is just almost incidental or accidental. I mean, we have to also explore the origins as well in order for this to make sense.
Well,
if you want to talk about race, variation in colors and so forth.
yeah. For somebody like Du Bois, there's a certain sense in which it's perfectly right to say that the physical characteristics associated with race are accidental. They aren't really the essential thing, right? There is no racial essence. There is no essence I have inside me, certainly no physical thing, no biological thing that makes me into a black person, because I don't have enough in common or enough of significance in common with just any other black person. Right? I mean, I have a lot in common with my fellow black people that I don't have in common with white people, you might say, but I don't have anything of significance. I have a lot in common with a chimpanzee. There's nothing of significance, right? You can mark a significant difference off between me and the chimpanzee. You can't mark a biologically significant difference that's relevant to stuff like intelligence or morality and so forth off between black people and white people. They're very close in those ways. The things that are easily there to be used to make the distinction aren't significant. The color doesn't really matter. It's not even skin deep. That's what Du Bois wants to do. He wants to make it a cultural matter. He wants to say that blackness is cultural, a socio-cultural phenomenon, connected with this badge of insult that it's a socio-cultural phenomenon. And what I'm also trying to do is raise some difficulties for that. It's a little tricky, because it ultimately seems like he's got to collapse back into this physical thing that he wants to get away from in the first place. He wants to say there are no real physical differences of significance between blacks and whites. But you can say that at the same time you say that blackness is a sociocultural phenomenon, because it's a sociocultural phenomenon that depends on those physical differences.
How does, maybe this is a better way to frame this question, going back to Apia, how does proving scientifically that race doesn't exist impact society and how it operates?
Well, again, you could look at something like witch, right? Once you get scientific about who's sleeping with the devil and who isn't, right? You're going to realize it's pretty silly to start judging people on the basis of that criteria, and you're not going to inflict penalties on people for that.
So
and maybe
not,
once you realize that there's no biological difference of significance between blacks and whites, you're not going to oppress them.
But silly or not, there's people that still practice the occult and believe they have some interaction with the devil, and that gives them power.
And there might be people who are afraid of somebody because they think some old woman down the street is a witch, and they might throw a rock through her window or something like that.
So
Things like that do happen, but they shouldn't. And what you do with a kid who throws a rock through the window is you give them some education. And maybe what people who make racial distinctions should be given is education, not encouragement.
So that would be the vehicle.
Yeah, you start with science. You start with a genuine account of the science.
But the other thing we're cutting a whole lot of money out the game now. Because you're talking about your insurance companies who base their policies on certain things. You're talking about the drug companies. You're talking about all these other entities within economics that are like, you cut them out the game, what are we going to do?
Yeah. Okay, and it's certainly true that that's gonna make it hard, but that doesn't settle the question of whether we ought to try. It's gonna be very hard to get people to stop being racist.
So at the end of the day, with the physical difference still just basically, don't avoid your whole argument right there. Just because at the end of the day, we still, even though you're saying there's no real physical difference, there's outside physical difference.
But you can say that it's just a physical difference, right? I mean, it's not a significant physical difference. It's not a difference that makes a difference. I mean, it's a difference that makes a cultural difference, but it shouldn't. Right? I mean, there's a difference between the people who are characterized as witches and those who aren't. Like, there's a cultural difference between them, and maybe even there might even be physical characteristics that make you think that somebody's a witch. So the remedy for that is education, right? It's not something that you hold on to and take seriously. You don't say, well, this is a socio-cultural reality.
But still within this, don't avoid the whole argument just because of the simple fact that at the end of the day, there's still black people, there's still brown people.
There's still going to be people of different colors, but there are people with different color hair. And nobody pays any attention to that. Nobody thinks, oh, well, there's a redhead, must be, what would be associated with a fiber, something like that. Right?
Sneaky.
Sneaky.
I mean, but isn't it still arguable that there are still distinct physical differences? I mean,
Sure, and just
I don't know.
color of hair is
people with
another.
natural blonde hair. I know people that dyed their hair blonde.
Oh, I know.
I know people that put blue contacts
I
in.
know some blonde hair.
I know plenty of black people with honey blonde hair. Yeah. Sure. Well, look, I mean, there's some white people in the ancestry, right? But there's white people in every black person's ancestry, right? The average black American has 20% white ancestry.
How rare is that though? That's an anomaly in itself. I mean, it's not a whole slew of supposed black people with blonde hair and blue eyes walking around.
It's rare, but
I mean,
it's
most black people, yeah, there may be some physical differences. Well, not really physical differences, hair texture. There may be differences in hair texture, but you can still identify a certain hair type to black people.
What black person? I just saw some black person. I realized I was quite shocked to realize the person had blue eyes.
Because I've never met any black person with natural blonde hair. I understand that it don't happen.
It does happen. And moreover, even blue eyes is even stranger. I was just struck by who is this famous black person with blue eyes? I don't remember. I saw a color picture of him for the first time. I know that the saxophonist Dexter Gordon, if you know who that is, who was in the movie Ron Bishmark, he has blue eyes. Yeah, blue eyes, blonde hair, these things can happen in black Americans too. Again, they're signs of contact with the European strain.
Alfred Miller.
But okay, I grant you, it's a very
That's
big
what I'm
thing.
arguing.
And what that means is that there's going to be a large group of people that you can identify by means of these characteristics: dark hair, dark curly hair, dark eyes, dark skin, full lips, less projecting of. You know why white people get noses that point out and black people don't? It's because in colder climates you need to humidify the air before it goes in, and the nose that goes out humidifies the air more. So white people will have a characteristic like that, black people won't, and so on. Yes, you will be able, just like you will be able to spot the redheads and the blondes. The question is, what conclusions will you draw once you make these distinctions?
Because my granddaughter has blue eyes and blonde hair. However, her blonde hair is not as nappy as mine, but it's not as straight as a Caucasian person. But her eyes are just bright blue as they come.
Sure.
And then, but her characteristics, she has full lips, she has a full nose. So even though she has the blonde hair, blue eyes, when you look at the child, your thought is, well, when we look at her, of course, our thought is she's African American.
Yes, right.
Right there, with blonde hair, blue eyes.
Right. I mean, there are also a lot of white people who look black, right? Light skin, they look like light skinned blacks. The Bob Barr was one of the congressmen from Georgia, who was one of Clinton's chief nemesis. Somebody said he better not get stopped, on certain roadways, right? Because he has a very flat nose and full lips. He looks like a light skinned black man. A lot of Jewish people have very kinky dark hair. I remember when I was a kid in the 70s, people used to talk about the
you're talking about, they actually get those stereotypical traits from the African
Yes, I
ancestors,
will be.
whether they want to admit it or not.
I would definitely grant you that the history of black people in the world is, people don't understand. People think that black people are just in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, and they brought some over to America, and that's it. They brought some to the United States, and that's it. No, that's not true.
We was talking earlier about how those people, what they call chronologists, they measure the skull by the races. What's funny is, when they find a person with the phenotypical traits of the quote Negroid in a certain area, that's real sensitive to them, then they throw out the race. So that's why I'm like, I see what you're saying, like, okay, everybody, we got the same abilities as human beings, boom, boom, all that. But the reality is, some people throw out race because they don't want to fess up to the truth. Just like, okay, reparations. Now, if they throw out race legally, then now they can't give us what they owe us.
You mean the 48 million mule thing?
What is that?
Yeah, right, okay, so, well, definitely that was an issue in, Lord Connerly's bringing this, ballot measure up in California, because he's a foe of affirmative action. He thinks affirmative action hurts black people. He thinks that it lowers their self-esteem and so forth. Makes them think that they need a handout. I mean, I definitely not agreeing with that, because my experience of life at the highest levels of academia, I've been astonished by the levels of racism that I've encountered. But I've also been pleasantly surprised by the fact that there are not, a lot of people are not racist, right? And I benefited from affirmative action, and I think I have also suffered from, in some people's estimation, they assume, okay, well, he wouldn't be here if it weren't for affirmative action. He's probably not as smart as this white person, which in most cases has been utterly ridiculous. Right, he wants to get race out of all state language so that there can't be any issue of reparations or affirmative action and so forth. But it doesn't seem to me clear that thinking in non-racial terms necessarily entails the end of any kind of racial help or racial reparation. You can still identify the people who are the descendants of the slaves and who are living in poverty and who are discriminated against and so on, even if you don't think that they're being discriminated against because of something that's real in biology, because of something that's a real distinction that marks them out as a genuinely separate group from a scientific method, right? Just as you might say, okay, here's a person who's been called a witch your whole life, or here's a descendant of somebody who was burned as a witch and lost all her property. Maybe the city here owes her something because of that, right? You don't have to acknowledge the reality of witches to do that, in the same way you would have to acknowledge the reality of race to make any kind of reparations.
I have a question just about the whole scientific approach. That I think arguably when you take that sort of scientific approach, that the scientific approach will always have to resolve itself into something else. And let me tell you specifically what I mean is, so for instance, let's say you had the sort of like gene charts of these two different things, and then you say they look really close, they probably are the same. And then one's a dolphin, one's a human, right? And then it seems like after you look at sort of these scientific facts, whether or not those scientific facts mean anything, because I could say that means genetics is meaningless, right? So whether they mean anything, it seems like could arguably gets resolved in something else like, now put the things in front of me,
Yes.
and I'll say, well, obviously not.
Right.
Right, and I'm wondering if the same sort of thing with races, if you say, look, with the races, there's like, if there's barely any sort of genetic difference, that will become irrelevant in the sense that what it really comes down to is, okay, put some white people in front of me, some black people in front of me, and then you just sort of make the intuitive call, you know what I mean?
It's going to be a little more complicated than that, because presumably there are people who are going, as soon as they see black and white, they go, okay, there's my hierarchy, right? The
Right.
whites are on top, blacks are bottom. Doesn't matter what the blacks try to do to even things out. So you have to acknowledge that there are racists, right? But it's going to be something like that, right? It's going to be something like acknowledging the fact that
some point you just have to sort of experience what's being referred to scientifically. And that maybe the scientific part will get you some sort of foothold in getting the whole thing rolling.
Right.
But eventually, it seems like it's gonna have to come down to something that the scientific stuff isn't gonna tell you.
Right. And it's not even as if the scientific stuff is all that clear. As I was saying a little while ago, the scientists are still arguing about whether race is a reality, whether there are any significant distinctions that are caught by the typical distinctions among races, as if it were anything. And I mean, things are so screwy that we think that, okay, maybe there aren't any races, but gee whiz, at least there are species, right? And the question is whether all the whites and blacks are of the same species, and we get rid of these races, then everything will be fine. What's a species, right? As I said a second ago, talking about the chimpanzees, they're 98% and 98.5% identical with us, right? Maybe they're a member of our species. Maybe we can interbreed with them. The idea of species, and the layperson, like myself, typically thinks that it's sort of obvious, you know, who's in the same species and who's in a different species. But it's not. Mules, right? Everybody knows you can have a hybrid creature, a cross between a donkey and a horse. But you might say, well, they're sterile, right? You don't have fertile offspring. But that's not true. I mean, at least anecdotally for years, farmers have been announcing, by the way, my mule is fertile. And scientists have scoffed at them because there's something about the genome of the horse and the mule that seems as if this should be impossible. But recently it's been documented, right? They did a DNA test of what was claimed to be a fertile mule, and they found that it wasn't in fact a fertile mule in China. It's a 1 in a million event, but 1 in a million events, if something happens, 10 million times, you're gonna get 10 of them, right? So, it's also interesting that back in the 19th century, zoos, when they wanted to lure in patrons, would do things like breed jaguars and leopards, or lions and leopards together, and get jaguars, or leopards, or taimans, or ligers, right, and display them, like you have these weird hybrid species. It turns out that these creatures not only could produce offspring, but the offspring were fertile. So the typical way of understanding a difference among species doesn't really work. It's a statistical thing. You're very unlikely to get a fertile offspring if you try to make creatures of different species. And you could argue that species are no more real than races are. Darwin himself thought that species weren't real things. They're out there. It's just practically helpful to divide things up along species lines. Now, what does that mean for our discussion here? Well, it could be practically helpful to divide human beings up along race lines. Some scientists think so. Some scientists don't. And the thing to do is have a hard look at it. Have a hard look at the objective facts. It's not, perhaps, to say, well, it's too dangerous to give up the idea of race, or they'll never give up the idea of race, right? There's too much money involved, and let's leave it there. Let's try to be as objective as we can, says somebody like Appiah. And that's the way to make the situation better.
How long do I?
I've met him a couple times.
That's the same thing you talk about going on down. That's what I'm trying to get the correlation. When you go on down, you got a whole different thing he talks about.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Well, it's Africans, and his whole thing is his father was anti-Cormier. When his father died, he wasn't allowed to bury him. So for the last 40 years, his whole thing has been about anything that Cormier said they would have to go against. So when he goes to lay down, it's nothing of this stuff. It's like, it's anti-Cormier, blah, 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 blah. So I mean, the boy publishes this and he talks this, but then when he's over back home, it's a whole different ballgame. So I'm trying to figure out what,
What does anti-Cormier entail?
basically anything that has to do with any progress, with the whole thing of some of the nations, anti-government, tribal group versus, that whole. So, I was over in June, showing the papers of what he did before and so on. So I'm trying to get, is there a different game when he's here versus when he's there?
Well, I think you can be anti-nationalistic and also anti-race. I mean, it's very easy to both those things, right?
What are comfortable with? My
should split a nation up and not believe that racial differences are real. It's sort of easier to believe that there are these real and important cultural differences that have nothing to do with race. If you say that race isn't a reality, don't worry about race, worry more about linguistic group, worry more about histories of people you can distinguish without any reference to race. Seems to me. I think you can do more about this than I do. That's my question. Questions? Any other things we can bring up that we could talk about this all day, honestly. Call it a day or keep going?
Perhaps some of you keep going, some of us have to get back to work in school.
Yeah, we have food here, make it
They're at a low level. Only the second floor.
check it at the meeting.